I know that internal trade is a big preoccupation of yours. Um, uh, is that because James Moore, the federal industry minister, has started going around asking for it, or is that a parade that he's catching up to instead of getting in front of?
Well, I don't know whose parade it is. I think we've been talking about these issues for a very long time. Yeah. The current federal government are obviously interested in international free trade. They've been aggressive in concluding agreements, which I think most premiers appreciate. And on this one, I think we were talking about it almost at the same time, maybe a little bit of ahead, but it really doesn't matter. We appreciate the encouragement and the support. It is an issue that we can actually, we can make progress on ourselves. When I first became Premier, I was late to work on the labor mobility piece. Former Premier Calvert from Saskatchewan was really our representative on that, and we got an agreement. Gary Doer, great leadership there with public sector and private sector union leadership. And we saw a smooth rollout of labor mobility improvements, and so we can get something done here. We can harmonize to a greater extent. We can reduce some unnecessary regulations, the odd barrier that might exist, and just make the agreement have fewer exceptions to the trade agreement we have as provinces.
There's a big change in the dynamic since last year. Last year you had a minority premier from Ontario, you had a minority premier from Quebec. The Ontario premier has won her majority, and the Quebec premier has gotten kicked out, replaced by a federalist with a majority. You've now got the two biggest provinces in the country with majority governments for the next 4 years. Does that change the feeling around the table?
I think it does. I mean, it would whether it was for the large provinces. I'll just talk about Saskatchewan. If we faced a minority situation, I have to believe that would influence the tone and maybe the substance of our interventions here, the things that we want to champion, because our democracy is better than all the alternatives, but it's imperfect. And a minority government, those governments are typically more concerned about politics than a majority government. So I think it does have an impact, but a positive one. And I could say this: Premier Couillard has been just excellent in the meetings so far, and because he's got this balance that he seems to strike between being a clarion voice for the interests of Quebec, which are distinct, and being a federalist, wanting to make the country work, wanting to be engaged in discussions on internal trade and coming back onto the health minister's working group. He's confirmed that. Being a part of joint purchasing of pharmaceuticals, which that process started with when Giz and I had the chance to chair that group, chair the health ministers. So I think it's pretty hopeful right now. I think you can get more done when premiers come to the meeting and aren't necessarily checking calendar all the time against what we have to say. Not that you do that, but in every instance. But there's going to be a little bit of that when a minority government has to consider what's going on back home.
Is it at all frustrating? There's a nice big West bloc that has functioned at these meetings for a while, which includes honorary quasi-conservative Christy Clark and Hancock and yourself. Do you ever find yourself knocking heads with these Liberals from the centre?
Not necessarily, not in a partisan sense. Mm-hmm. The last few days we've had concerns about some trade barriers we think might exist in Ontario on the procurement side, and they're not sure they exist. We think our position's pretty strong, and hopefully that we can see some improvement there. So I don't think it's a partisan thing, but there'll be we each have our own interests in our own provinces, and the larger provinces are not an exception to that rule. I think that's part of it.
I want to ask briefly about missing and murdered Aboriginal women. The Prime Minister says all that's really needed is continued strong police work, and that a commission of inquiry would simply not get at the real issue. Why do you favor one?
Well, because I don't quite agree with the Prime Minister. I think that's a big part of it, and we've promoted something, whatever we do in terms of an initiative that the provinces and hopefully the feds could join. Maybe it's that round table. Is that there'd be 3 phases, and the first piece is around justice and reducing the risks for, hopefully eliminating the risks for these women and girls. But there is a societal element here, and we know that because we've been trying some things in Saskatchewan, and some have worked better than others. But one particular model that's really worked is something we call, for want of a better term, the hub and core method, where we've asked all the local. We haven't asked. We borrowed this from the city of Prince Albert, where the police chief there, and we now have him as a deputy in our government. where he pioneered a process where we literally knocked down the silos between all the agencies that deal with people in vulnerable positions, at-risk folks in Prince Albert, social services, education, the health region, the police force, and they were able to identify that from frontline input, including in education, identify those at-risk people and get ahead of challenges. And it has worked. In fact, we're exporting it to North Battleford, and Yorkton's going to be next. That's why we hired the deputy away from the city of Prince Albert as our deputy minister. Well, that's not just the crime piece. There's other elements there. Finally, the third phase is responsibility. I would like to hear, and I know this will be the case, but I'd like to see a process that's focused on Aboriginal responsibility, right at the grassroots, bands and councils, dads. What are we doing, especially when you consider that 43% of the violence against Aboriginal women comes from someone in the family, a spouse usually, someone close, family and friends. Mm-hmm. So those are the three phases we'd like to see, and I think the Prime Minister has one of them, but I think there's other things.